Okay, you are seeing my slideshow now?
Yep.
Not sure. Okay. Um, so hello, I'm Lizzie Goeddel. I'm one of the grad students in the Soar lab here at U of M, and I'm going to be talking about my research on moving forward with motion planning for Soar. And I want to start
Lizzie, I'm sorry, you're breaking up a little bit, so I would recommend,
shutting off my video.
yeah,
Okay,
see if that helps.
let me try that. Okay. I should be gone, so hopefully this is better. So I wanted to start by describing my long-term goal in creating a motion planning system for Soar. In the future, we want to have robotic Soar agents, maybe like Rosie, that learn to do many different tasks. And these many different tasks will require a wide variety of arm motions. So even just looking at this robot that makes a bed and unloads dishes from a dishwasher and goes grocery shopping, these three tasks span a really wide variety of types of arm motions. And so when I say a motion planning system for Soar, I mean something general enough to support an agent like this. And the question is, what will it actually take to get us to agents like that? And my claim is that it will be a coordination of SOAR and motion planning. So not just improvement of SOAR, not just improvement of motion planning, but the coordination of both. And here's why. At this point, you probably understand the value of SOAR in that it can be the system component that decides the next thing for this robot to do would be to put the fork in a drawer and then pick up the bowl and then put the bowl away. In other words, reasoning about action preconditions and effects and how to chain them together to get to a goal state. However, for a robot, there's actually a whole second part to this system, and that is the system component that actually moves the robot's arms and plans the motion to reach the drawer and then move the arm back, and then motions for each of the subsequent actions. And this second part of the system is typically a motion planning algorithm. And some examples of existing motion planners are RRTs or PRMs or trajectory optimizers like TrajOpt. And the exact details of the specific algorithm aren't important right now, but what is important is that this is what allows a high degree of freedom arm to move through a world without hitting any obstacles. So the follow-up question is, why is it actually difficult to create a system with both motion planning and SOAR? And the short answer to that is that there is a representational divide. SOAR represents actions discretely, something like this, where there's preconditions, there are results. It's a very high-level view of the action with no geometric information about the trajectory. On the other side of the divide, the motion planner represents trajectories continuously. And so they might look something like this, where it's a sequence of joint positions for the arm to reach to get from the robot's start position to a goal position. And you may be thinking, well, we've had SOAR control robots in the past. Obviously, there is a solution to this divide. And you're right, but it's not a great solution. The standard solution is a one-way translation from this discrete representation to a request to a motion planner. And the one-way translation and the separation here actually causes a lot of problems. And they all come down to the central problem that discrete action representation doesn't include any of that geometric information I was talking about. And so here are a few things that SOAR agents can't actually do with regards to motion. The first one is that agents can't compare different trajectories that accomplish the same action. So if you think about it, any given reaching action, for example, could actually be implemented by a number of different trajectories with different properties. And so we would like for the agent to be able to query the motion system and say, which of the available trajectories keeps the arm farthest away from a lamp, for example, or which of the available trajectories will reach the target the fastest. Another type of reasoning that agents can't do right now is actually consider what trajectories are available and their properties when deciding which action to take. So if you think about it, deciding which action to take is actually very tied to the problem of figuring out how to implement it with a trajectory. And so separating those two problems in the way that we do means that our agents can't ask things like, are there any available trajectories that are careful enough to meet my current requirements? Or is there an alternative action with trajectories that better fit those requirements? Then finally, and this is something that James just hinted at, agents can't recall trajectories for future use in similar situations. So we would like to be able to reuse trajectories from the past and have the agent be able to ask things like, which trajectory was used in the past when there was a lamp to the robot's left? Or even reasoning about that past trajectory, such as how close did the arm get to the lamp in that trajectory? And so my research has been developing a solution to this problem that would actually allow agents to do these kinds of reasoning. And at a really high level, the solution that I've been pursuing is to use objectives to extend agents' representation and processing of actions to actually include motion, so geometric information. And when I say objectives, here are a few examples. The idea of an objective is that it's a trajectory feature that isn't necessarily definitely necessary for completing an action, but it is relevant to other types of performance metrics. And so things that may serve as objectives are things like clearance from obstacles, the length of a trajectory, how much it obscures a sensor, and how much energy it will take, and there are a lot of other options there. And so this solution would result in knowledge in Soar that looks something like this, where an action is no longer represented completely abstractly, it also is attached to trajectories that could possibly implement it. And those trajectories are described by their objective values. Here I've used clearance and time as just hypothetical examples. But implementing this type of structure in Soar is a non-trivial problem due to the divide that I've talked about. And so for the rest of my talk, I'm going to first focus on some of my past work that is part of the solution to this problem, and then move on to some future work that will hopefully serve as the other part of the solution puzzle. So I wanted to return to the standard solution that we use in most Soar agents today for connecting Soar to a motion planner. And what you see here is the one-way translation that I talked about, where Soar makes a decision, it sends some information to the motion planner, and a trajectory is planned. I already mentioned objectives, but some of the other information in this pipeline includes constraints. These are the things that are definitely necessary for an action to be successful. And typically for us, that means the trajectory's target, so a specific gripper pose or an area for the robot's gripper to reach. Interestingly, our systems don't really make use of objectives right now. And there are a lot of practical reasons for this, but the biggest one is that existing motion planning systems don't actually handle them all that well. They may handle one particular objective or a few objectives of the same type, but they may not efficiently handle other types of objectives, like clearance objectives are particularly difficult for certain types of planners. And so we want a pipeline that both allows our agents to use objectives effectively and makes for more flexible reasoning between SOAR and the motion planner. And so the solution that I've developed over the past few years is called MAST. It stands for Motion Planning with Agent Selection of Trajectory. And you can see here how it differs from the standard solution. It breaks up what used to be one step into two separate steps, one handled by the motion planner, but one where SOAR actually gains back control and gets to do more reasoning. The first step is called trajectory set creation, and it creates n valid trajectories that satisfy constraints. You'll notice that in this first step, we only look at constraints and don't consider objectives. That comes in the second step, where SOAR actually gets to now consider its objectives, takes the trajectory set and turns it into one final best trajectory through a selection process. And so that final trajectory is the choice is based on objectives, and that's what's actually executed on the robot. So MAST at this point has been implemented outside of SOAR and tested fairly extensively. And so I'm just going to give you the briefest highlight of some of the results from that. Here, what you're seeing is the effect of increasing n, so the parameter of trajectory set size, on the quality of the trajectory that is ultimately chosen. Here, we're using the end effector movement objective, which is how much the robot's gripper moves across a trajectory. And you can see the overall trend of the more trajectories in a set, the better and better the objective value gets. This was a really cool result for a few reasons. First of all, it means that our pipeline is working. So the final trajectories actually do reflect the agent's objective because we're seeing improvement over the baseline here. Being able to show that higher n leads to better objective values is also very reassuring. It means that the more trajectories you consider, you're usually able to find better results. But the most interesting thing here was that I've only shown you one objective, but this pattern actually held up for all 5 of the objectives that we tested. And they varied in what type of objective they were. So in other words, MAST handles many types of objectives really flexibly, and that's not something that other motion planning systems necessarily do. And so we've changed up the pipeline to be more flexible, and we've also opened the number of objectives that the pipeline can handle. So this is really cool. But there's a whole second part of the solution, and that mostly involves integration with SOAR in the architecture. And so I'm going to be talking about an upgrade to SVS and a little bit of proposed work on long-term memory SOAR trajectories. And so the first part of this is a proposed new version of SVS that I'm calling SVS+T. You probably remember SVS from previous talks. So all I need to do is remind you that right now it contains a scene graph. The proposed change will make it look something more like this. So it will edit its relationship to motion and working memory a little bit. And the biggest change will be that we're adding a trajectory representation to SVS. And so that trajectory representation will come along with a place to store the current trajectories that actually fit the current scene graph along with the scene graph in SVS. And so that set of trajectories will actually serve as you may have guessed, the trajectory sets for MAST. Another important part of this will be to add an interface to working memory to allow SOAR to access information about those trajectories. I'm calling the central part of that interface trajectory descriptors, which are brief descriptions of trajectories like objective values. And this is how objective values are going to be made available to the rest of SOAR. And this is what's going to allow SOAR to actually do the MAST selection step. So the last thing is, you may be remembering that I said we wanted to reuse past trajectories. And so that gets us into the territory of long-term memories. And that's some new work that we've just started talking about, but there will definitely be the addition of a trajectory long-term memory for SVS+T to interact with. And this will store past trajectories that the agent has used in past situations. So adding that memory alone would be really interesting, but there are also all of these new potential non-symbolic long-term memories that James just talked about, such as the scene graph long-term memory would have really interesting interactions with the trajectory long-term memory. And the trajectory long-term memory's interaction with other types of long-term memory, including the symbolic ones, will also be really interesting to work out. And so these are some potential architectural updates. Hopefully they will be coming soon. And I'm really excited to get started on this work, which just leaves the traditional nuggets and coal. So on the plus side, MAST, the pipeline change has a lot to offer SOAR agents. That includes access to new reasoning abilities. It includes access to objective values and reasoning via objective values. And in the long run, improved robot control in general. The extension to SVS and the long-term memories should be really interesting from the architectural point of view and also from the point of view of the common model of cognition. And there's also this great synergy with James and other people's interest in non-symbolic long-term memories. Motion is a really important part of that, and it will be really interesting to work through all of it. Some downsides though, like I mentioned, the integration of MAST with SOAR has just started, so we'll see how that goes. And the structure of the non-symbolic memories is also up in the air, but hopefully those are goals that we'll deal with over the next year or so. So thank you for listening. I am happy to take any questions now.
Yeah, there's a couple of questions. I'm gonna go backwards order here. Aaron asks, are there any other types of motion planning, so not just arm movement, that you think would benefit from this method?
Sure. So I've thought just a little bit about navigation, because navigation can also be represented as trajectories, and I think that it would be really interesting to try out MAST with navigation trajectories and see whether the same types of improvements actually show up. I would expect that there is some improvement, and also having multiple forms of motion would mean possibly multiple forms of motion long-term memory. But so far I've only tested it with arms, and the reason is that the high degree of freedom arms are particularly difficult to control, and they've been particularly difficult for SOAR and other symbolic reasoning systems to interface with. And so that's where like my research focus has been so far.
All right, another question. How would MAST handle if, say, the SOAR agent impassed when it was trying to select a trajectory? Is that possible?
Oh, good question. So, like I said, we've only tested MAST with a really simple selection program so far. And so part of the integration work that I'm doing right now is going to get into some of those questions. I think it would be dependent on the agent itself to, like, it would be agent specific how things like that would be handled. Yeah, I don't have a good answer to that right now because we haven't tested it out with agents that are complex enough to impasse. But that is something I'm working on right now, and so hopefully that's a question I can answer in a couple of months.
All right, there's one more question. Officially, we do end here and have a break, but I'll go ahead and ask it. A break, not end, excuse me. Anyway, how would MAST handle intractable trajectory spaces?
So a request that's completely impossible, I'm guessing is the question there.
Or like a super hard motion, I guess.
Yeah, so that is also a good question. So far, the quantitative evaluation of MAST entirely made sure that these motions were possible, just so that we could understand its behavior. In terms of impossible requests, actually MAST may be able to handle those better than a lot of existing motion systems, because you can provide MAST with a slightly more general request and get many different trajectories. And so while it's pretty easy to provide an impossible request to any one motion planner, MAST has a little bit more flexibility to explore different trajectories that might be possible. And also the integration with agent reasoning might be really helpful there, because if a request is completely impossible and MAST is just like, nope, there are no trajectories for that, the agent might be able to say, oh, okay, so what if I make this request instead, and sort of have a back and forth, a dialogue about like why that was impossible and what could be done instead.